Dear friends, subscribe and hit the bell. Your support allows us to continue our investigations. On July 12, 1942, a tall, bespectacled figure appeared in the doorway of a simple village barn in the village of Tukoveji. The man was dressed in a plain tunic without insignia, but his posture, demeanor, and heavy, piercing gaze revealed him to be someone accustomed to giving orders to thousands of people. The barrels of automatic rifles were pointed at him, but he did not try to flee. He slowly raised his hands and uttered a phrase that would forever divide the history of the Great Patriotic War into before and after, transforming a hero into an outcast. He said, "Don't shoot. I am General Vlasov." At that moment, amidst the smell of damp hay and moisture, the biography of Stalin's favorite, the savior of Moscow, ended, and the story of the most famous traitor of the 20th century began. But to understand how a lieutenant general, whose name resounded on the pages of central newspapers, ended up in that barn, one must rewind the tape of time to when the word, quote, "3" sounded like a synonym for hope and steel-like resilience. Just 6 months before these events, in the winter of 1941, the name of Andrei Andreevich Vlasov was uttered with bated breath. It was he, commanding the 20th Army, who played a key role in the counter-offensive near Moscow. His portraits were printed in the newspaper _quote _4_ alongside those of Zhukov and Rokossovsky. He was not just a general, he was the embodiment of Soviet success, a man who stopped the invincible Wehrmacht at the gates of the capital. Stalin personally summoned him, entrusted him with the most difficult sections of the front, and called him one of the most talented commanders. Vlasov's career rise was rapid, and it seemed unstoppable. The son of a simple peasant, he rose from a private in the Civil War to a lieutenant general, possessing charisma, intellect, and the ability to find common ground with soldiers. It seemed that only marshal's stars and a place in the pantheon of great commanders awaited him. It was this credit of trust and high reputation that led the Stavka of the Supreme High Command to send Vlasov to one of the most critical sectors in the spring of 1942, the Volkhov Front. The situation there was catastrophic. The Second Shock Army, intended to break the siege of Leningrad, found itself in a deep pocket, cut off from the main forces. The terrain consisted of continuous peat bogs, where it was impossible not only to dig trenches, but even to find a dry patch of land for the night. Soldiers drowned in liquid mud, equipment sank up to its turrets, and the wounded froze in icy water right on their positions. Vlasov flew there as a savior, as a top-level crisis manager called to perform a miracle where others had given up. But there are no miracles in war. There are only dry logistical figures and merciless geography. When Vlasov arrived at the headquarters of the Second Shock in April, he saw a scene of absolute apocalypse. An army of over 130,000 men was slowly fading away in the icy slush. Supplies were cut off. The corridor connecting the encircled forces with the mainland was under constant fire and shrinking daily. People ate tree bark, boiled leather belts and boot shafts. There were no ammunition. There were no medicines. The wounded lay directly in the water, awaiting the inevitable end. Food trains were stuck tens of kilometers from the front line. Vlasov understood. This was not just an encirclement. It was the slow execution of an entire army. The first dispatches to Stavka were filled with alarm and despair. He demanded immediate permission to retreat, to break out of the cauldron at any cost. But orders from Moscow kept coming to advance, hold on, and execute the operation plan, a plan that had long since lost touch with reality. In these forests, Amidst the decaying swamp vapors, an invisible but terrible breakdown of personality was taking place. The general saw his army turn into a crowd of doomed shadows. He saw the senselessness of the orders he had to transmit downwards. His ambitions, his belief in his own exceptionalism, collided with a reality where he was powerless. The Soviet system, which had elevated him to the top, now seemed to indifferently watch his demise. It was here, in the encirclement, that the seed of resentment was sown. Resentment not for the soldiers, but for himself. For being thrown to the slaughter, he, so talented and promising. Fear of captivity mingled with fear of responsibility. After all, if the army perished, he would have to answer to Stalin. And Stalin did not forgive defeats, even if they were objectively inevitable. By early summer, the corridor had finally slammed shut. German troops closed the ring, turning the cauldron into an open-air mass grave. Of the 130,000-plus men, only a handful managed to escape. The rest either died of hunger and disease or were taken prisoner. In the last days of the cauldron's existence, a special plane was sent for Vlasov. This was a chance for salvation, a ticket to life. But the general refused to fly. Soviet propaganda would later claim that he simply chickened out of running to the plane under fire. Other sources say that he allegedly wanted to share the fate of the soldiers. But the truth most likely lay in the plane of cold calculation. To return to Moscow without an army meant a tribunal and execution. To stay here meant captivity or death. Vlasov chose a third path, the path of survival at any cost, even if the price was honor. He disbanded his staff, smashed his radio, and went into the forests with a small group of close associates. He ceased to be a commander and became a fugitive, hiding not only from the Germans but also from his own people. Several weeks of wandering through the Volkhov swamps turned the general into a ragged tramp. Hunger, cold, and constant tension exhausted him physically. But the moral choice had already been made. When the elder of the village of Tukovyeji handed him over to the Germans for a loaf of bread and a bottle of vodka, Vlasov offered no resistance. In that shed, he did not just surrender. He made the decision to start a new game, where his life and, as he convinced himself, the fate of Russia were at stake. Upon arriving at the German headquarters, he almost immediately declared his readiness to cooperate. This was not the result of torture or prolonged ideological indoctrination. This was the offer of a professional who changes employers. His first interrogations showed that before the Germans sat not a broken prisoner, but a man with a plan. Abwehr officers were astonished by the Soviet general's readiness to switch sides so quickly. Vlasov did not ask for mercy. He offered a deal. He spoke of millions dissatisfied with the Stalinist regime, of collective farmers who hated collectivization, of the repressed whose families awaited revenge. He offered the Germans not just information, but a political project, the creation of a Russian Liberation Army under his command. Thus began the second act of the tragedy. Vlasov understood perfectly well that a mere defector was expendable. To survive and retain status, he needed to become a political figure. He began to create a myth of fighting the Stalinist regime for a free Russia. In his speeches and leaflets scattered over Soviet trenches, he spoke of fighting Bolshevism, of a free Russia without collective farms and party commissars. He used rhetoric that could resonate in the hearts of people who had suffered from collectivization and the repressions of the 30s. Leaflets with his appeals were printed in millions of copies. They featured a portrait of the general in uniform with stars and text calling for crossing over to the side of the liberators. But behind these beautiful words lay a monstrous lie. Vlasov proposed fighting for Russia's freedom in alliance with those who, in their doctrine, considered Slavs subhuman, subject to enslavement or physical extermination. General Plan Ost envisioned the extermination of 80% of the Soviet Union's population and the transformation of the remainder into beasts of burden. Vlasov knew this, or preferred not to know it, but the fact remained. He became the face of a regime's propaganda whose ultimate goal was incompatible with the existence of the Russian people as such. The paradox of the situation was that the German leadership, particularly Hitler and Himmler, regarded Vlasov with disgust and distrust. They used his name as a propaganda tool, as a means to demoralize the Red Army. But for a long time they did not give him real power and did not allow him to form combat units. The Führer categorically rejected the idea of arming Russians. For him, Slavs were a biologically inferior race, and arming them meant creating a threat to his own rear. Vlasov lived in villas, drank French wines, wore a German uniform with ROA insignia, married a German secretary, creating the illusion of vigorous activity. While he delivered speeches about freedom, millions of Soviet prisoners of war perished in concentration camps from hunger, cold, and abuse. According to historians, out of more than 5 million Red Army soldiers captured, less than 2 million returned home. The rest disappeared in camps, were shot, or died from illness and exhaustion. The tragedy was that many of these prisoners, driven to extreme desperation, joined Vlasov's formations simply to survive. For them, Vlasov's name was a straw to grasp, a chance to get food, clothing, to avoid a concentration camp. For Vlasov himself, these people were merely a resource, an argument in his bargaining with the Nazi elite. He, a former communist and party member since 1930, adopted the anti-Bolshevik rhetoric of his new masters with astonishing ease. His appeals began to feature notes of anti-Semitism, characteristic of Nazi propaganda. He signed documents that spoke of Judeo-Bolshevism and the need to cleanse Russia of alien elements. In November 1944, the so-called Prague Manifesto, a programmatic document of the Vlasov movement, was published in Prague. It declared noble goals: the overthrow of Stalin's tyranny, the establishment of a people's government, the liquidation of collective farms, and the restoration of freedoms. But this manifesto was written under the dictation of German curators and represented a mixture of national socialist ideas camouflaged as a national liberation movement. Vlasov's internal conflict during this period was an attempt to justify his betrayal with a noble goal. He convinced himself and others that he was smarter than the Germans, that he was using their resources and organization to create a real military force with which he would overthrow Stalin, and then turn his weapons against Hitler. This was a beautiful fairy tale for internal consumption. In reality, Vlasov was a puppet in the hands of Goebbels' department, a face on a leaflet calling for shooting his brothers. His speeches to prisoners, his trips to camps, all of this was part of the psychological war against the Soviet Union. Only at the very end of 1944, when Germany's position became hopeless and the Red Army was already storming the borders of the Reich, did the Nazis finally allow Vlasov to form full-fledged divisions. This was a gesture of despair from a dying regime. Goebbels and Himmler hoped to use Russian units to plug holes on the front. Vlasov received the army he had dreamed of for 2.5 years, but he received it when the war was already definitively and irreversibly lost. The 1st Division of the ROA, under the command of General Bunyachenko, numbered about 20,000 men. The 2nd Division was being formed but did not manage to complete its training. These units consisted mainly of former prisoners of war whom the Germans had finally agreed to arm. And here, another unexpected turn of events occurs, demonstrating Vlasov's true nature. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the blows of the Allies from west and east, Vlasov again tried to switch sides. In early May, an anti-German uprising broke out in Prague. The Czechs took up arms, trying to liberate the city before the arrival of the Red Army. Units of the 1st Division of the ROA under Bunyachenko's command were nearby. Vlasov saw in this an opportunity for political rehabilitation. He gave the order to turn their weapons against the Germans and help the rebels. The 1st Division attacked German troops, liberated several city districts, captured prisoners and equipment. Vlasov hoped that this gesture would be credited to him by the Western Allies. He expected to surrender to the Americans and appear before the world as a fighter against tyranny, as a representative of a third force, hostile to both communism and Nazism. He sent emissaries to the American command with a proposal for cooperation. But the Czechs, having learned that they were being liberated by Vlasovites, collaborators who had served Hitler, demanded their immediate departure. For them, the Red liberators were preferable to the White traitors. Vlasov realized that his gamble had failed. The Prague adventure only accelerated the denouement. He rushed along the roads of Czechoslovakia, trying to make contact with the American command, hoping for political asylum. But the geopolitical map had already been drawn. In Yalta, the leaders of the Big Three agreed on the repatriation of all Soviet citizens who found themselves in territories controlled by the Allies. For the Americans, Vlasov was not a political leader of the anti-Stalinist opposition, but a collaborator who fought on the side of the enemy. When Vlasov's motorcade was stopped by an American Army patrol on May 12, 1945, the officers treated him without any reverence. They showed no interest in his political projects and effectively allowed a Soviet Smersh operational group to make the arrest. The circle was closed. The man who had betrayed twice, first his country, then his new masters, was needed by no one. At the moment of his arrest, he was pulled out of the car, where he was hiding under a carpet, as if repeating the scene in the barn 3 years earlier. Only now, there was neither dignity nor hope. He was taken to Moscow, to Lefortovo prison, where a lengthy investigation process began. Interrogations were conducted methodically and harshly. Vlasov tried to justify himself, citing the hopelessness of the situation in the Second Shock Army, his disillusionment with the Soviet system, and his desire to save Russia from Stalin. But before the interrogators sat not an ideological fighter, but a broken man trying to save his skin with any words. The investigation lasted over a year. During interrogations, Vlasov admitted to facts of collaboration with the Germans, but denied his treason, claiming he fought against Stalin, not against the motherland. This casuistry could deceive no one. Along with him, other leaders of the ROA were arrested: Malishkin, Trukin, Zakutny, Bunyachenko, Meandrov, and others. The trial was closed. The authorities feared not what Vlasov would say, but the effect his words might produce. After all, the betrayal of a general of such a level, a hero of the defense of Moscow, was a blow to the very myth of the monolithic unity of the Soviet people in the face of the enemy. On July 30, 1946, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR delivered its verdict. Andrei Vlasov and 11 of his associates were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to the supreme penalty by hanging. The sentence was carried out the next day, August 1st, in the courtyard of Butyrka prison. Thus ended the earthly path of a man who could have become a marshal, but became a symbol of betrayal. His surname became a household name in the Russian language for many decades. Vlasovets, Vlasovite, became the term for any collaborator, traitor, or person who went over to the enemy's side. The story of Andrei Vlasov is not just a chronicle of betrayal, it is an anatomy of moral fall, where personal ambitions are placed above duty and survival becomes the sole religion. His biography makes one ponder the nature of heroism and betrayal, the thin line between them. After all, only half a year separated him from being a hero of the defense of Moscow to a collaborator. What happened during those 6 months? Did Vlasov himself change? Or did something that was always hidden inside manifest itself? Debates about this continue to this day. Some historians assert that Vlasov was a cynic and a careerist from the very beginning, that his patriotism was merely a mask he wore as long as it was advantageous, that his ambitions always prevailed over principles, and the tragedy of the Second Shock Army merely gave him a pretext to shed the mask. Others see in him a tragic figure, a victim of a system that itself created traitors with its cruelty and cynicism. They point to the mass repressions of the 30s, the executions of commanders on the eve of the war, and the monstrous errors of leadership that cost millions of soldiers' lives. In this logic, Vlasov is a product of Stalin's terror machine, a man who was simply the first to realize the absurdity of the system. A third viewpoint attempts to find a middle ground. According to it, Vlasov was a talented military leader, a sincere patriot at a certain stage of his life, but a man with a weak moral core. When he faced a situation where there were no good choices, he chose the worst. He failed the test of tragedy and preferred life over honor. His crime is not that he was captured. That is the fate of millions of soldiers in war. His crime is that he turned his captivity into a political project directed against his own country. He could have simply sat out the war in a camp, as thousands of other captured officers did. But he chose the path of active cooperation with the enemy. It is important to understand the historical context. The Great Patriotic War was a war of extermination. Hitler's Germany waged against the Soviet Union not merely a military campaign, but a racial war, the goal of which was the physical annihilation of Slavic peoples and the liberation of living space for the German race. Plan Ost envisioned the destruction of 30 to 50 million people in the occupied territories. In these conditions, any cooperation with the occupiers was not a political choice, but complicity in genocide. Vlasov and his propagandists tried to present the ROA as a national liberation movement fighting simultaneously against communism and Nazism. But this was a lie. The ROA was created, funded, and controlled by German special services. It never had any real independence. All the beautiful words about a free Russia were merely a cover for serving the Hitlerite regime. When Vlasov tried to distance himself from the Germans at the end of the war, it was already too late. His attempt to attach himself to the Prague uprising looked pathetic and cynical. The Czechs correctly assessed the situation. A man who had served the Nazis for 3 years could not suddenly become a fighter for freedom. Today, 80 years after those events, the phenomenon of Vlasov makes us ponder the nature of choice in extreme situations. At a critical moment, when the world around us crumbles, what prevents a person from falling? Where is the line between the instinct of self-preservation and the loss of one's humanity? The example of the Second Shock Army gives us two poles of the human spirit. On one side are tens of thousands of nameless heroes who preferred to die in the swampy mire rather than surrender or betray their comrades. On the other side is a brilliant general who chose life and shame. These nameless remains are still being recovered by search parties in the forests near Myasnoy Bor. Each find, a medallion, a helmet, a rusty automatic rifle, is a silent reproach to someone who decided that his life was worth more than honor. In the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were attempts to rehabilitate Vlasov, to present him as a fighter against communist tyranny. Some publicists wrote about him as a tragic hero who embarked on a struggle against an inhumane regime. But these attempts shattered against the harsh reality of facts. One cannot be a fighter for freedom while serving a regime that built concentration camps and gas chambers. The lessons of this story are universal and timeless. Charisma, talent, past achievements are not an insurance against moral downfall. A person is tested not in parades or moments of triumph, but in situations of extreme despair, when one has to choose between life and dignity. Vlasov showed that intellect without a moral core can lead to monstrous consequences. He created a precedent for justifying evil with good intentions, a trap into which many fall even today. His tragedy is a reminder that there are lines that must not be crossed, because beyond them begins the disintegration of personality, which is more terrifying than any physical end. In the modern world, where information wars have replaced trench warfare, Vlasov's story takes on new meaning. Betrayal today does not necessarily mean defecting to the enemy's camp. It can manifest in more subtle forms, in the abandonment of basic values for personal gain, in the readiness to justify any means to achieve a goal, in the cynical manipulation of other people's ideals. Vlasov was a master of such manipulation. He spoke to exhausted prisoners about freedom, promising them salvation, but led them to serve a regime of slave owners. His fate also shows the danger of the cult of personality and belief in a savior. Thousands of people believed Vlasov simply because he was a general, a hero, a man with a name and accolades. They did not ask themselves, what kind of hero serves those who burn entire villages along with their inhabitants? What kind of liberator wears a uniform with a Nazi swastika? Critical thinking is what many Vlasovites lacked. They wanted to believe that there was an easy path to salvation, that one could fight against Stalin in alliance with Hitler and remain pure. History brutally dispelled these illusions. Concluding this complex conversation, our thoughts return to that very barn door in the village of Tukoveji. Imagine that moment of silence before he utters the fateful words. He had an instant to choose a different ending. He could have drawn a pistol and taken his own life, as many German generals did in similar situations. He could have walked out with his hands raised and simply surrendered, without offering cooperation. He would have remained a tragic figure in history, but not a traitor. Instead, he stepped into the darkness, dragging thousands of fates who believed his words along with him. And this darkness swallowed him forever, leaving us only a cautionary tale of how high one can soar and how low one can fall, when one's own self eclipses the rest of the world, and fear for one's life becomes stronger than all principles and oaths.